They left her to rot in the dirt like garbage, until one man made her an offer that changed everything. In a town where mercy died with the morning sun, Lena Crow became invisible, starving, broken, discarded behind a crumbling building while decent people walked past like she didn't exist. But when a stranger named Ethan Hale appeared with an impossible proposition, she faced a choice: die forgotten in the dust, or risk everything on one brutal chance at survival. This is her story. Stay until the end, hit that like button, and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this journey reaches. Now, let's begin. The sun beat down on Grafton's edge like a hammer on an anvil, turning the packed dirt streets into waves of shimmering heat. Lena Crow sat with her back against the splintered wood of Murphy's abandoned general store, her body folded into itself, trying to become smaller. Invisible. It wasn't hard. She'd had plenty of practice. 3 days without food. Maybe 4. Time got slippery when your stomach ate itself from the inside out. She watched boots pass by. Worn leather, polished Sunday shoes, a child's scuffed sneakers. None of them stopped. None of them even slowed. She'd learned not to ask anymore. The first dozen times she'd begged, people looked at her with disgust, like she was a dead animal they'd stepped too close to. The last few times, they didn't look at all. That was worse. Lena pulled her knees tighter to her chest, feeling the sharp jut of bone through the thin fabric of her dress. A dress that used to be blue, used to fit, used to belong to someone who mattered. Now it hung off her frame like a burial shroud, stained with dirt and sweat and the kind of defeat that doesn't wash out. Pathetic. The word came from above. Lena didn't need to look up to know it was Margaret Chen, the baker's wife, standing there with a basket of fresh rolls that smelled like heaven and felt like torture. I said you're pathetic. Margaret's voice had that particular edge that came from someone who'd never missed a meal in her life. Sitting here like you expect the world to fix your mistakes. Lena kept her eyes on the ground. Responding only made it worse. My husband works 14-hour days, Margaret continued, her voice rising just enough for passers-by to hear, to gather an audience. I'm up before dawn baking bread. Everyone in this town earns their keep, but you just sit here with your hand out I'm not expecting anything. Lena's voice came out scratchy, broken from disuse. Then why are you still here? It was a fair question. Lena had asked herself the same thing every morning she woke up in the narrow space between Murphy's store and the old church wall. Why stay in a place that wanted her gone? Why keep breathing when breathing hurt this much? Because leaving meant walking into the desert with no water, no supplies, no destination. Because dying slow here was somehow better than dying fast out there. I asked you a question. Margaret's foot appeared in Lena's field of vision, tapping impatiently. I don't have an answer. Margaret made a disgusted sound in her throat. You know what? I'm done pretending to care. Next time I see you here, I'm getting Sheriff Walsh. We have laws against vagrancy. She walked away, her basket swinging, leaving behind the smell of yeast and the confirmation that Lena had maybe one more day before even this small space would be taken from her. The afternoon crawled by with the speed of infection. Lena drifted in and out of a state that wasn't quite sleep, wasn't quite consciousness. Somewhere in the haze, she heard voices, the familiar rhythm of the town conducting its business, buying and selling, living and thriving, all of it happening in a world that had edited her out completely. You see her? Don't look, just encourages her. I heard she used to work at the hotel before she started drinking. I heard it was drugs. Does it matter? Look at her now. The stories they told about her had stopped being true months ago, but truth didn't matter much when people needed someone to look down on. Lena Crow had become whatever the town needed her to be, a cautionary tale, a moral lesson, proof that bad things only happen to people who deserved them. It made everyone else feel safer. The sun was starting its slow descent toward the horizon when Lena heard different footsteps, heavier, slower, purposeful. They stopped right in front of her. Lena kept her eyes closed, pretending to sleep, hoping whoever it was would move on. But the boots didn't move. She could feel someone standing there, studying her, and the silence stretched out until it became unbearable. You Lena Crow? A man's voice, deep, unfamiliar. Lena opened her eyes slowly, squinting against the light. The man standing over her was tall, maybe 6'2", with the kind of build that came from actual work, not a gym. His face was weathered, maybe 40, maybe 50, with lines carved deep around his eyes and mouth. He wore a faded blue shirt with the sleeves rolled up, jeans that had seen better years, and boots that had walked through more than dust. "Who's asking?" Her voice came out defensive, suspicious. Strange men asking questions rarely led anywhere good. "Ethan Hale." He said it plain, like she should know the name. When she didn't react, he continued. "I run a ranch about 15 miles west of here. Small operation. Just me." Lena waited. There was always more. "I'm looking for help." "I don't have any money." "I'm not asking for money." Ethan shifted his weight, glancing up the street before looking back at her. "I'm offering work." The word hung in the air between them like something fragile, something that might shatter if she grabbed for it too quickly. "Work," Lena repeated slowly. "One night. You help me with something that needs doing, I'll pay you in food and a place to sleep. After that, we see if it makes sense to continue." Lena's mind raced, trying to find the trap. Men didn't just offer desperate women work out of kindness. There was always a price, always something they wanted that had nothing to do with labor. "What kind of work?" "The kind that needs doing." Ethan's expression didn't change. "I've got fence posts that need setting before the rain comes. Post hole diggers are sitting idle. You look like you could use a meal, and I could use hands that aren't my own for once." Why me? It was the question that mattered most. Why walk up to the most broken person in town when there were plenty of young men who'd work for cash, plenty of families who'd send a son or daughter for honest labor? Ethan was quiet for a moment, his eyes scanning the street again. "Because everyone else in this town turned their backs when I needed help 6 months ago. My wife died. Cancer. Took 8 months from diagnosis to the end, and in that time not one person from this community showed up. No meals, no help with the animals, nothing but prayers and empty words." His jaw tightened. "So when I need something done, I'm not inclined to ask them. And when I saw you sitting here looking like the rest of this town's trash, I figured maybe you'd understand what it's like to be forgotten." The honesty was brutal and unexpected. Lena studied his face, looking for traces of the cruelty she'd learned to recognize. But all she saw was exhaustion and anger, not at her, but at the same people who'd made her invisible. "If I say yes," she started, "then you stand up and we leave, now, before anyone decides to tell me all the reasons I shouldn't trust you." Lena's body screamed at the thought of standing, of walking, of doing anything that required energy she didn't have. But the alternative was staying here, waiting for Sheriff Walsh to run her out of town, waiting for her body to finally give up the fight. It wasn't really a choice. "Okay." She planted her palms on the ground, feeling the bite of gravel and broken glass. Her legs shook as she pushed herself up, the world tilting sideways for a moment before steadying. When was the last time she'd stood? Really stood? Ethan didn't offer his hand, didn't rush to help. He just waited, giving her the space to do it herself, and somehow that felt more respectful than any gesture of pity would have. When Lena finally made it to her feet, swaying slightly, she realized how tall he actually was. She barely came up to his shoulder. "You got anything you need to bring?" Ethan asked, glancing at the empty space where she'd been sitting. Lena shook her head. Everything she owned was already on her body. "All right then." Ethan turned and started walking toward a dusty pickup truck parked at the end of the street. "Let's go." Lena took one step, then another, her bare feet finding purchase on the familiar dirt. She'd lost her shoes 2 weeks ago, traded them for half a sandwich that had made her sick anyway. Now every step reminded her exactly how far she'd fallen, but she kept walking. They hadn't made it halfway to the truck when a voice cut through the air. "Ethan Hale! What the hell do you think you're doing?" Lena recognized the voice before she saw the face. Reverend Thomas Merrick, the spiritual leader of Grafton's Edge, striding toward them with his Bible in one hand and righteous indignation radiating off him like heat. Ethan stopped, but didn't turn around. "Walk into my truck, Tom." "With her?" The disgust in Merrick's voice made Lena's skin crawl. "With that woman?" Now Ethan turned, and something in his expression made the Reverend hesitate mid-stride. Her name is Lena Crow, and what I do on my own property is none of your concern. It is when you're bringing corruption into... Corruption? Ethan's laugh was sharp and cold. That's rich coming from a man who preaches charity every Sunday, but hasn't given a dime to anyone who actually needs it. A small crowd was forming now. Word traveled fast in small towns, especially when there was conflict to witness. Merrick's face flushed red. This woman is a drunk, an addict. She's made her choices, and you don't know a damn thing about her choices. Ethan took a step forward, and despite being 6 inches shorter, Merrick stepped back. But I know about yours. I know you stood in my house after Sarah died and told me it was part of God's plan. I know you took the casserole someone made for me and gave it to the Johnson family because they're active in your church. I know you've walked past Lena Crow for weeks without seeing her because she doesn't pay tithes. The crowd had grown larger. Margaret Chen stood near the front, her basket forgotten. Sheriff Walsh lingered near the back, his hand resting casually on his belt. So here's what's going to happen, Ethan continued, his voice carrying across the street. I'm going to get in my truck with Miss Crow here, and we're going to drive to my property. If anyone has a problem with that, they can come say it to my face right now. Silence. The kind that feels like pressure building before a storm. Lena wanted to disappear, wanted to sink back into the ground and become invisible again. This attention, this conflict, it was the last thing she needed. Ethan... Her voice came out barely above a whisper. You don't have to... Yeah, I do. He didn't look at her, keeping his eyes locked on Merrick. I'm done pretending this town has any moral high ground. Merrick straightened his spine, gripping his Bible tighter. You're making a mistake. That woman will rob you blind, bring nothing but trouble. Then that's my problem to deal with. Ethan finally broke eye contact with the Reverend, turning back toward his truck. Come on, Lena. She followed, feeling dozens of eyes burning into her back. The whispers started before they'd gone 10 feet. He's lost his mind. Grief does terrible things. Give it a week. She'll steal everything and disappear. Should have known better than to trust Hale. He was always strange. Ethan reached the truck first and opened the passenger door. The interior looked clean, well-maintained, a working vehicle, not a showpiece. Lena hesitated at the threshold, reality hitting her all at once. She was about to get in a truck with a strange man and drive to an isolated ranch 15 miles from town. Every survival instinct she had left was screaming at her to run. But run where? Back to the dirt behind Murphy's store? Back to starving slowly while the town pretended she didn't exist? Second thoughts? Ethan asked, his hand still on the door. I don't know you. Lena met his eyes. You don't know me. This could be a lot of things, Ethan finished. Could be the worst decision either of us makes. Could also be the only chance you've got left. It was the truth, plain and simple. No sugarcoating, no false promises. Lena climbed into the truck. The engine rumbled to life, and Ethan pulled away from the curb without looking back at the crowd. Lena did look back, watching Grafton's edge shrink in the side mirror, watching the people who'd made her invisible become specks in the distance. The Reverend stood in the middle of the street, still holding his Bible, looking like a man who'd just lost an argument he'd expected to win. They drove in silence for the first 5 miles, leaving the scattered buildings of town behind and entering the vast emptiness of open land. Scrub brush and dust stretched out in every direction, interrupted occasionally by the skeleton of a dead tree or the rusted remains of farming equipment someone had abandoned decades ago. Lena kept her hands in her lap, very aware of how out of place she looked in this clean truck. She could smell herself, 3 days of sweat and dirt and desperation, and wondered if Ethan was regretting his decision already. There's water in the glove box, Ethan said suddenly, breaking the silence. Bottles. Lena opened the compartment and found 3 sealed bottles of water sitting next to a folded map and a small first aid kit. She took one, her hands shaking slightly as she twisted the cap off. The first sip was careful, controlled. The second was desperate. Before she knew it, she'd drained half the bottle. Easy, Ethan warned, not unkindly. You'll make yourself sick. Lena forced herself to slow down, to put the cap back on, to save some for later. But the water was already working its way through her system, awakening parts of her body that had started shutting down. "Thank you," she said quietly. Ethan just nodded, his eyes on the road. Another mile passed before Lena worked up the courage to ask the question that had been burning in her mind since they left town. "Why did you really choose me?" Ethan was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "I told you the truth back there. This town abandoned me when Sarah got sick, but there's more to it." He paused, his jaw working like he was chewing on words too bitter to swallow easily. "Sarah and I tried for years to have kids. Never happened. The cancer took that possibility away before we even knew she was sick. After she died, I realized something. I'd spent my whole life building something to pass on, and there's nobody to pass it to. No family, no friends who gave a damn. Just me and a piece of land that'll outlive me by centuries." Lena didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. "When I saw you sitting there," Ethan continued, "I saw someone who'd been written off the same way I'd been written off. Someone the town decided wasn't worth the effort. And I thought, hell, maybe we're both better off without them." It wasn't a pretty sentiment, and it wasn't wrapped in charity or kindness. It was just honest, raw, real. "I'm not going to pretend to be something I'm not," Lena said carefully. "I don't know if I can do the work you need. I don't know if I'll last more than a day. I'm not asking for promises." Ethan glanced at her briefly before returning his attention to the road. "I'm asking for effort. You give me that. We'll figure out the rest." The truck hit a pothole, jolting them both. Lena gripped the door handle, her body too weak to absorb the impact smoothly. Every bump felt like it might shake her apart. "How much farther?" she asked. 10 miles, maybe less." 10 miles might as well have been 100. Lena's brief surge of energy from the water was already fading, replaced by the familiar weakness that had become her constant companion. "Tell me about the ranch," she said, partly to stay awake, partly to fill the silence. "Not much to tell. 160 acres my grandfather homesteaded back in the 30s. Cattle operation mostly. Had as many as 200 head at one point, but after Sarah got sick, I had to sell most of them. Down to about 40 now. Enough to keep things running, but not enough to make real money." "You do everything yourself?" "Have been for the last year." There was no pride in his voice, just exhaustion. "Hired hands cost money I don't have, and like I said, nobody from town was offering help for free." Lena watched the landscape roll by, trying to imagine what it would be like to own all this space, to be responsible for all of it. She'd lived her entire adult life in rooms she rented by the week, in spaces so small you could cross them in 4 steps. The idea of acres upon acres of land felt impossible to grasp. "Why fence posts?" she asked. "Northern section has a break, cattle keep wandering through, getting onto the highway. Already lost 2 that way. Department of Agriculture says if I can't keep them contained, they'll fine me, or worse, take the whole herd as a hazard." "When's the deadline?" "Already passed it." Ethan's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Got an extension until end of week. That's 3 days from now." Lena did the math in her head. 1 woman who could barely walk and 1 man who'd been working alone for months, trying to repair a fence line in 3 days. It seemed impossible. The truck crested a small rise, and suddenly the ranch came into view, a single-story cabin that had seen better decades, a barn that leaned slightly to the left, a handful of outbuildings in various states of disrepair, and land. So much land it made Lena's breath catch. "Home sweet home," Ethan said without enthusiasm. As they got closer, Lena could see the details her eyes had missed from a distance. Peeling paint on the cabin, shingles missing from the barn roof, weeds growing tall around equipment that hadn't moved in months. It was a place that had once been cared for, once been loved, and was now just hanging on by its fingernails. Not unlike herself. Ethan parked the truck near the cabin and killed the engine. The sudden silence felt enormous, broken only by the wind moving through dry grass and the distant sound of cattle lowing somewhere out of sight. "Come on inside," Ethan said, climbing out of the truck. "I'll get you fed, then we'll see about getting you cleaned up before we start work." Lena opened her door and stepped down, her bare feet hitting dirt that was somehow different from town dirt, softer, less packed, still holding some memory of what it had been before the drought. She followed Ethan to the cabin, her legs threatening to give out with every step. The inside of the cabin was dim and cool, a relief from the relentless sun. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and living space all at once. Simple furniture, well-worn but clean. Dishes drying in a rack by the sink, a wood stove that looked like it got regular use. And on the walls, photographs. Dozens of them. Lena's eyes were drawn to a large frame picture above the mantel, a woman with kind eyes and a genuine smile, standing next to a younger version of Ethan, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. "Sarah." "Sit," Ethan said, gesturing to the kitchen table. "I'll heat up some soup." Lena sank into the nearest chair, her body grateful for any horizontal support. She watched as Ethan moved around the kitchen with practiced efficiency, lighting the stove, pulling a pot from the cabinet, ladling what looked like vegetable soup from a container in the refrigerator. "Made this yesterday," he said, more to himself than to her. "Should still be good." The smell hit Lena like a physical force. Carrots, potatoes, celery, spices she couldn't name but remembered from a time when food was normal, expected, not a luxury. Her stomach cramped painfully, reminding her exactly how long it had been since she'd eaten anything substantial. Ethan set a bowl in front of her, steam rising off the surface. He handed her a spoon and then stood back, leaning against the counter, arms crossed. "Eat slow," he warned. "Your stomach's not used to it." Lena barely heard him. She lifted the spoon with shaking hands, brought it to her lips, and tasted the first real food she'd had in days. It was perfect. It was terrible. It was everything. Tears sprang to her eyes without warning, hot and unexpected. She tried to blink them back, to maintain some shred of dignity, but they came anyway, silent, unstoppable, mixing with the soup as she ate. Ethan didn't comment, didn't offer comfort. He just let her cry and eat, giving her the space to fall apart without an audience demanding she explain herself. Lena ate half the bowl before her stomach signaled it couldn't handle any more. She set the spoon down carefully, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet." Ethan pushed off from the counter. "You've got a long night ahead of you." He led her to a small bathroom off the main room, just a toilet, sink, and a shower stall that had seen better days. A clean towel sat folded on the counter, and next to it, a set of work clothes that looked like they might fit. "These were Sarah's," Ethan said, nodding at the clothes. "She was about your size. Might be big on you now, but they'll work better than what you've got." Lena looked down at her ruined dress, at the dirt caked into fabric that might never come clean. "I'll be outside when you're done," Ethan continued. "Take your time. Water pressure's not great, but it's hot." He left, closing the door behind him. Lena stood alone in the small bathroom, staring at her reflection in the mirror above the sink. The woman looking back at her was barely recognizable. Sunken cheeks, hollow eyes, skin stretched too tight over bone. Her hair, once brown and thick, hung in matted clumps around her face. She looked like death taking a break. Lena turned on the shower, waiting for the water to heat up. When steam started rising, she peeled off her dress and stepped under the spray. The water hurt. It burned against skin that had forgotten what clean felt like, found every cut and scrape and bruise she'd accumulated. But Lena stood there anyway, letting it wash away days of filth, watching brown water swirl down the drain. She found soap and shampoo on a small shelf and used them both, scrubbing until her skin turned pink, until her fingers pruned, until she finally felt like a human being instead of something the world had thrown away. When she finally turned off the water and stepped out, wrapping herself in the towel Ethan had left, Lena felt lighter. Not hopeful, she'd learned better than that, but lighter. Like maybe she could survive one more day. She dressed in Sarah's clothes, canvas work pants that hung loose on her hips, a flannel shirt that swallowed her frame, thick socks that felt like luxury. The clothes smelled like storage and cedar, like they'd been waiting for someone to need them. Lena emerged from the bathroom to find the cabin empty. Through the window, she could see Ethan loading tools into the back of his truck, post hole diggers, a sledgehammer, coils of wire, wooden posts stacked like soldiers. She went outside, her borrowed socks finding Ethan's wife's old work boots by the door. They were half a size too big, but after weeks barefoot, they felt like armor. "Ready?" Ethan asked without looking up from his work. "As I'll ever be." He finally looked at her then, his eyes scanning her transformed appearance with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You look human again. Feels strange." "Yeah." He loaded the last of the posts. "I bet it does." They drove north across Ethan's property, following tire tracks that had been carved into the earth by years of the same journey. The sun was lower now, painting everything in shades of amber and rust. In different circumstances, it might have been beautiful. The fence line, when they reached it, was exactly as bad as Ethan had described, maybe worse. 20 feet of wire had come completely loose from the posts, which had rotted through at ground level and now leaned at drunken angles. Beyond the break, Lena could see cattle grazing dangerously close to what had to be the highway, though she couldn't see the road itself from here. "Jesus," she breathed. "Yeah." Ethan killed the engine. "We need to pull these old posts, dig new holes, set the new posts, string the wire, and hope to hell it holds until I can afford proper repairs. In 3 days. In 3 days." Lena climbed out of the truck, staring at the work ahead of them. Her body already ached from the simple act of showering and getting dressed. The idea of digging post holes, of manual labor that would require strength she didn't have, seemed impossible. But Ethan wasn't asking if she could. He was asking if she would try. "Show me what to do," Lena said, and as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, as the temperature dropped from brutal to merely oppressive, Ethan Hale and Lena Crow began the work that would either save his ranch or prove that some things were too broken to fix. The post-hole digger was heavier than it looked. Lena gripped the handles, positioned the blades where Ethan indicated, and drove them into the ground. The impact rattled through her arms, into her shoulders, down her spine. She lifted, twisted, pulled up a modest scoop of dirt. "Again," Ethan said. He was working on pulling the old post free, his muscles straining against wood that didn't want to give. Lena drove the digger down again, and again, and again. By the 10th repetition, her hands were screaming. By the 20th, she'd developed blisters on top of blisters. By the 30th, she couldn't feel her hands at all, which was somehow worse. "How deep?" she gasped. 3 feet. Ethan finally freed the old post, tossing it aside. "You're at maybe 1. Lena wanted to cry, wanted to quit, wanted to collapse right there and let the earth take her. Instead, she drove the digger down again. The work continued as the sun set, as stars emerged in a sky so vast it made Lena feel small and insignificant. Ethan set up battery-powered work lights that turned the fence line into a small island of visibility in an ocean of darkness. They didn't talk much. There wasn't energy for conversation, just the rhythm of work. Dig, lift, dump, repeat, pull wire, measure, cut, string, test the tension. Somewhere around midnight, Lena's body gave out. Not dramatically, she just sank to her knees mid-motion, the post-hole digger slipping from her hands. Ethan was there immediately, crouching beside her. "You done?" "I don't know." Lena's voice was hoarse. "Maybe." "Look at me." She did. His face was shadowed in the harsh work light, impossible to read. "You got 1 hole dug tonight," Ethan said. 1 complete hole, 3 feet deep, ready for a post. That's 1 more than I had before you showed up. That's not nothing." "It's not enough." "No," he agreed. "It's not. But it's a start." He helped her to her feet, and they drove back to the cabin in silence. Lena's entire body was one continuous ache, pain so complete it became almost abstract, something happening to someone else. Back at the cabin, Ethan pointed her toward a small room off the kitchen. "Guest room. Used to be an office, but Sarah made me convert it. Said we needed space for visitors we never actually had." The room was tiny, barely large enough for the single bed and small dresser inside, but it was clean and private and hers. "Sleep," Ethan said from the doorway. "We start again at dawn." "Ethan?" He paused, waiting. "Why are you really doing this?" He was quiet for a long moment, then, "Because I'm tired of being alone. Because this place needs more than one person to survive. Because maybe I'm just as desperate as you are, in a different way." He left before she could respond, closing the door gently behind him. Lena collapsed onto the bed, not bothering to undress, not bothering to get under the covers. Sleep took her immediately, dragging her down into darkness, where her body finally stopped screaming long enough for her mind to rest. When she woke, pale light was filtering through the small window. Her body felt like it had been beaten with hammers. Every muscle protested as she forced herself to sit up, to stand, to shuffle toward the kitchen where she could smell coffee brewing. Ethan was already up, dressed in fresh work clothes, pouring 2 cups of dark liquid that looked like salvation. "Drink this," he said, handing her a cup. "Then eat something. We've got a long day." Lena took the coffee, wrapping her damaged hands around the warm mug. She looked down at her palms, blistered, raw, swollen. "They'll toughen up," Ethan said, following her gaze. "Or they won't, and you'll have to figure out if you can work through it anyway." It wasn't cruel, just honest. Brutal and honest, like everything else about this place. Lena drank her coffee and faced her second day, not knowing if she'd survive it, knowing only that she had to try. The second day started before Lena's body was ready for it. Her hands had stiffened overnight into claws, the blisters weeping fluid that stuck to the sheets. When she tried to grip her coffee cup, pain shot through her palms like electricity. "You need to wrap those," Ethan said, nodding at her hands. He was already finishing his breakfast, eggs and toast that he'd made while she was still trying to convince her legs to work. "With what?" He disappeared into the bathroom and returned with medical tape and gauze. "Sit." Lena sat, extending her hands palm up on the table. Ethan worked quickly, wrapping each hand with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before, who understood that working through pain was just part of the job. "Sarah had bad arthritis toward the end," he said, not looking up from his work. "Hands swelled up so bad some days she couldn't hold a fork. But she'd still try to help with the animals, said sitting around made it worse." It was the first time he'd talked about her in present tense, then caught himself. Lena saw the muscle in his jaw flex. "Did it?" Lena asked. "Make it worse sitting around?" "Don't know. She never actually sat around long enough to find out." He finished the second hand, tearing the tape with his teeth. "These won't last long once you start digging. You'll need to rewrap them every few hours." "Okay." "And you need to eat." He slid a plate toward her. 2 fried eggs, 3 pieces of toast, more food than she'd seen in one place in months. Lena's stomach had shrunk so much that the idea of eating it all seemed impossible. But she tried anyway, forcing down bites that her body desperately needed but struggled to process. She managed 1 egg and a piece of toast before nausea kicked in. "That's all I can do," she said. Ethan looked at the remaining food, then at her. "You're running on fumes. This work's going to eat you alive if you don't fuel up." "I'm trying." "Try harder." His voice wasn't cruel, just matter-of-fact. "Save the rest for later. We'll bring it with us." They loaded up the truck as the sun cleared the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange that would have been beautiful if Lena had the energy to notice. Her body moved mechanically. Lift, carry, load, repeat. The work boots rubbed against her heels, promising blisters in new places. The drive to the fence line felt shorter in daylight. Lena could see the full scope of Ethan's property now. Rolling hills of dry grass dotted with cattle, occasional stands of scrub trees that had somehow survived the drought, and in the distance, the dark line of the highway where 2 of his cows had already died. When they reached yesterday's work site, Lena felt something unexpected. Pride. The single post hole she'd completed looked small and insignificant against the scope of what still needed doing, but it was real. She'd made that. "We need 6 more holes today," Ethan said, surveying the fence line. "That'll give us enough posts set to restring the wire by tomorrow night." 6. Lena did the math. If 1 hole had nearly destroyed her yesterday, 6 seemed impossible. "I'll take 3. You take 3. Work smarter, not harder." He handed her a pair of leather gloves. "Put these on over the bandages." The gloves were stiff and too large, but they provided a barrier between her ruined hands and the post-hole digger's handles. Lena positioned herself at the spot Ethan indicated and drove the blades into the earth. The first hour was agony. Every muscle that had screamed yesterday was screaming louder now, joined by new areas of pain she hadn't known existed. Her back seized up after the 20th plunge. Her shoulders burned after the 40th. By the 60th, she was crying silently, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her face. But the hole got deeper. "Take a break," Ethan called from where he was working 30 feet away. His own hole was already past 2 feet, his rhythm steady and efficient. "I'm fine," Lena lied. "You're crying. That's not fine." "It's just sweat." "Bullshit." Ethan drove his digger into the ground one more time, then walked over to where she stood. "Sit down before you fall down." Lena wanted to argue, wanted to prove she could push through, but her legs made the decision for her. They simply gave out, dropping her onto the hard ground. Ethan crouched beside her, pulling a canteen from his belt. "Drink." The water was warm and tasted like metal, but it was wet. Lena drank deeply, then wiped her mouth with the back of her gloved hand. "How deep am I?" she asked. Ethan glanced at her hole. "Maybe 18 inches?" 18 inches. Not even halfway. At this rate, she'd never finish 3 holes by sunset. "I'm slowing you down," Lena said. "Yeah, you are." No point denying it. "But if you quit now, I'm still slower than if you keep going." "That's shitty math." "It's honest math." Ethan stood, offering his hand. Lena took it, letting him pull her to her feet. His grip was strong, calloused, the hand of someone who'd been doing this work his entire life. 10 more minutes, he said. Then another break. We'll get there. They worked in intervals after that. 10 minutes of digging, 5 minutes of rest. The sun climbed higher, turning the air into soup, making every breath feel like drowning. Lena learned to pace herself, to find a rhythm that her body could maintain, to ignore the voice in her head that kept insisting she couldn't do this. By noon, she'd completed her first hole of the day. By 2, the second. Her hands had gone numb inside the gloves, which was both a blessing and a warning sign. The bandages were soaked through with blood and fluid. "That's enough for you today," Ethan said, appearing beside her as she started on the 3rd hole. "You're done." "I can finish." "No, you can't. Look at your hands." Lena pulled off the gloves. The bandages had shifted, exposing raw flesh underneath. Blood mixed with dirt created a paste that clung to her palms. "Shit," she breathed. "Yeah." Ethan took the post-hole digger from her, setting it aside. "Go sit in the truck. I'll finish up here." "That's not fair. You're doing all the work." "Fair's got nothing to do with it. You've pushed yourself past breaking. Keep going and you'll do permanent damage." He pointed toward the truck. "Go." Lena walked on shaking legs to the vehicle, collapsing into the passenger seat with the door open, letting what little breeze existed cool the sweat on her face. She watched Ethan work, his movements efficient and relentless, finishing her 3rd hole in a fraction of the time it would have taken her. Then he moved to his own final hole, and Lena saw something she hadn't noticed before. He was limping. Not much, just a slight hitch in his step every time he drove the digger down and had to brace himself. He was hurting too. Maybe not as much as her, maybe not in the same ways, but this work was breaking him down just like it was breaking her down. The difference was he'd learned to work through it, to compartmentalize the pain into something manageable. Or maybe he just didn't have a choice. The sun was setting by the time Ethan finished the last hole. He loaded the tools back into the truck bed without a word, his face blank with exhaustion. When he climbed into the driver's seat, Lena could see the tremor in his hands as he gripped the steering wheel. "How's your leg?" she asked. "Fine." "You're limping." "It's fine." His tone made it clear the subject was closed. They drove back to the cabin in silence. Lena's entire body had locked up from sitting, and when they arrived, she wasn't sure she could get out of the truck without help. Ethan was already halfway to the cabin before he noticed she hadn't moved. "You coming?" he called back. "Working on it." He walked back, opened her door, and stood there looking at her with an expression somewhere between annoyance and understanding. "It's easier if you do it fast, like ripping off a bandage." "I don't think I can." "You made it through today. You can make it 10 more feet." But he offered his hand anyway. Lena took it, letting him pull her out of the truck. Her legs nearly buckled, but she stayed upright through sheer stubbornness. Together they walked to the cabin, Lena leaning more heavily on Ethan than she wanted to admit, Ethan supporting more weight than he let on. Inside, he pointed her toward the bathroom. "Clean those hands properly. There's antibiotic ointment in the cabinet. Use it." While Lena soaked her hands in warm water, watching the basin turn pink, she heard Ethan moving around the kitchen. The smell of cooking meat drifted through the door, something frying, something that made her stomach wake up despite her exhaustion. When she emerged, hands freshly bandaged, Ethan had set the table with 2 plates of steak and potatoes. Real food. Substantial food. "Sit," he said, already cutting into his own meat. Lena sat, staring at the plate. Where did this come from? Freezer. Had a steer butchered last year, been living off it since. He took a bite, chewing slowly. Sarah always said red meat was good for healing. Made me eat it after I threw out my back one summer. She sounds like she was smart. She was. Ethan's eyes flickered to the photograph above the mantel. Too smart to end up with me, probably, but she did anyway. Lena cut into her steak, the meat tender and perfectly cooked. The first bite was almost overwhelming, iron and salt and richness that her depleted body craved on a cellular level. They ate in silence for several minutes before Ethan spoke again. "You did good today." The words caught Lena off guard. "I barely kept up." "You kept going. That's what matters." He pushed his plate aside, half the steak still uneaten. "Most people would have quit after yesterday. Hell, most people wouldn't have started." "I didn't have a choice." "Everyone's got a choice. You chose to get in my truck, chose to pick up that digger, chose to keep going when your body was telling you to stop." He met her eyes across the table. "That's not nothing, Lena." It was the first time he'd said her name without it being necessary, and something about the way it sounded in his voice made her chest tight. "Why does this place matter so much to you?" she asked. Ethan was quiet for a long time, his fingers tracing patterns on the wooden table. "My grandfather built this cabin with his own hands. Raised 4 kids here during the Depression. My father took it over, expanded the herd, made it profitable. I grew up knowing every acre, every fence line, every dry creek bed. This land is the only thing I've ever really owned." He paused, his jaw working. "Sarah and I were supposed to build something here, pass it on to kids who never came. When she got sick, she made me promise I wouldn't sell, wouldn't give up on it just because she was gone." His voice cracked slightly. "But it turns out running a ranch alone is damn near impossible, and keeping a promise to a dead woman is even harder." Lena didn't know what to say to that, so she just listened. 3 months after Sarah died, I thought about torching the whole place," Ethan continued. "Just burning it down and walking away would have been easier than watching it fall apart piece by piece." "Why didn't you?" "Cowardice, maybe, or stubbornness. Hard to tell the difference sometimes." He stood, collecting their plates. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow we set the posts." But Lena couldn't sleep. Despite her exhaustion, despite pain that radiated from every part of her body, her mind wouldn't shut off. She lay in the small guest room, staring at the ceiling, thinking about everything she'd lost and everything she might be building. Somewhere around midnight, she heard Ethan moving around in the main room. Footsteps pacing back and forth, the creak of floorboards, the sound of someone who couldn't settle. Lena got up, wrapping herself in the thin blanket from her bed, and padded into the kitchen. Ethan stood at the window, looking out at the darkness, holding a glass of something amber-colored that definitely wasn't water. "Can't sleep either?" he asked without turning around. "Hurts too much." "Yeah?" He took a sip of his drink. "That doesn't really get better, you just get used to it." Lena joined him at the window. Outside, the land stretched away into nothing, no lights anywhere, just stars so thick they looked like spilled salt. "I was married once," Lena said suddenly. The words surprised her as much as they seemed to surprise Ethan. "What happened?" "He liked to use his fists when I disagreed with him. After the 3rd time I ended up in the emergency room, I left. Took nothing but the clothes I was wearing. Thought I was doing the right thing, being strong, starting over." She laughed, but it came out bitter. "Turned out being strong doesn't pay rent. Starting over requires resources I didn't have." "How long ago?" 2 years? Maybe 3? Time gets fuzzy when you're just trying to survive." She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "I had jobs at first. Waited tables, cleaned houses, whatever I could find. But every time I'd get settled somewhere, he'd find me. Show up at my work, make a scene, get me fired. Eventually, I ran out of places to run to, ended up in Grafton's Edge because it was small enough I thought he wouldn't bother looking." "Did he find you there?" "No, but it didn't matter by then. I'd already lost everything else. Ethan was quiet, processing this. Then, is that why you were behind Murphy's store? I was sleeping there, yeah. Couldn't afford the flophouse anymore, and nobody would hire me. Became easier to just disappear. She turned to look at him. You asked me yesterday why I got in your truck, why I'd trust a stranger. Truth is, dying fast with you seemed better than dying slow alone. I'm not going to hurt you, Ethan said. I know, I figured that out when you gave me food before asking for work. Lena gestured at her bandaged hands. This pain I can handle. It's the kind that comes from doing something, building something. The other kind, the kind that comes for free, just for existing. That's what breaks people. Ethan finished his drink, setting the glass on the windowsill. You planning to stay after the fence is done? Are you asking me to? Depends. You planning to rob me blind like Reverend Merrick said? Despite everything, Lena smiled. I wouldn't know what to take. And even if I did, where would I go? Back to Grafton's Edge so they can tell me I told you so. So that's a no? That's a, I don't know what I'm doing past tomorrow, but if you're willing to let me stay, I'm willing to keep working. She met his eyes. Fair? Fair. They stood there in comfortable silence, two broken people looking out at the empty land until Lena finally felt tired enough to try sleeping again. The third day was somehow worse and better simultaneously. Worse because every part of Lena's body was staging a rebellion, refusing to cooperate with even basic movements. Better because she was starting to understand the rhythm of the work, starting to anticipate what Ethan would need before he asked for it. Setting the posts was different from digging the holes. It required precision, not just endurance. Ethan would lower a post into the hole while Lena held it vertical, checking it with a level, making sure it stood perfectly straight. Then they'd fill in around it, packing dirt tight, adding concrete mix that Ethan had been saving for this exact job. Too far left, Ethan said, squinting along the fence line. Lena adjusted the post slightly. Other way, just a hair. She moved it back. There, hold it. Lena held the post steady while Ethan filled in the hole, her arms screaming from the static weight. When he finally gave the okay to let go, the post stood firm and straight, ready to hold wire that would keep the cattle contained. 1 down, Ethan said. 6 to go. By the 4th post, they'd developed a system. By the 6th, they were working in near silence, each knowing what the other needed without discussion. It was the kind of synchronization that came from shared purpose, from two people focused on the same goal. The sun was setting when they set the final post. Ethan stepped back, surveying their work with an expression Lena couldn't quite read. We did it, she said. We did most of it. Still need to string the wire, and that's its own nightmare. Can't we have one moment of not worrying about the next thing? Ethan looked at her, and for the first time since they'd met, she saw him almost smile. Not quite, but close. Yeah, I guess we can. They stood there as the sky turned colors, two people covered in dirt and sweat and the proof of honest work, looking at 7 fence posts that stood straight and true against the horizon. That night, Lena's hands hurt less. Or maybe she was just getting used to the pain, learning to carry it like Ethan did, as part of the job, part of the price of making something that lasted. She was almost asleep when she heard a vehicle approaching. Not Ethan's truck, something heavier, diesel engine, moving fast. Then voices, multiple people, angry and getting closer. Lena sat up, her heart hammering. Through the window, she could see headlights cutting through the darkness, 2 trucks pulling up to the cabin. Ethan was already in the main room, pulling on his boots. His face was hard, set. Stay inside, he told her. Who is it? People from town. He grabbed a rifle from above the doorframe, checking to make sure it was loaded. Stay inside, Lena. I mean it. But she followed him anyway, staying in the doorway as Ethan stepped onto the porch. 5 men climbed out of the trucks, and even in the dim light, Lena recognized 2 of them, Reverend Merrick and Sheriff Walsh. Evening, Ethan, the sheriff said, trying to sound casual and failing. Mind if we talk? Depends on what about. Ethan held the rifle casually, not pointing it at anyone but making its presence known. About her? Merrick pointed at Lena in the doorway. About you harboring a vagrant on your property, potentially endangering this community. My property, my business. Not when it affects the rest of us, another man said. Someone Lena didn't recognize. That woman's got a history. She's unstable, probably dangerous. You don't know a damn thing about her history, Ethan said, his voice low and dangerous. We know enough. Sheriff Walsh stepped forward, his hand resting on his belt near his gun. Look, Ethan, we're not here to cause trouble. We're here because people are concerned. They see you bringing this woman onto your land, working her out here alone, and they worry. Worried about what exactly? About what happens when she steals from you, when she burns your cabin down, when she does whatever desperate people do when they're cornered. Merrick's voice had taken on that preacher cadence, performing for an audience that wasn't there. We're trying to help you before something terrible happens. By running her off in the middle of the night? That's your version of help? By encouraging you to make better choices. The Reverend pulled a folded paper from his jacket. We've drawn up a petition. 37 signatures from concerned citizens requesting that the county remove Miss Crow from the area for her own safety and ours. Ethan stared at the paper like it was a snake. You got 37 people to sign something saying Lena Crow is too dangerous to exist in this county? We got 37 people who care about this community's welfare. You got 37 people who'll sign anything you put in front of them if it makes them feel righteous. Ethan's grip tightened on the rifle. Get off my property. Ethan, Walsh started. Get off my property. The men exchanged glances. This wasn't going the way they'd planned. We can make this difficult for you, Merrick said, his voice hardening. The county can revoke your agricultural exemptions. The bank can call in your loans early. We can make it so you lose this place, Ethan. Is she really worth that? The question hung in the air like smoke. Lena wanted to speak, to tell Ethan it was okay, that she'd leave, that he didn't need to fight this battle. But something kept her quiet. Maybe pride, maybe curiosity about what he'd say. Ethan looked at the men standing in his yard, then back at Lena, then at the rifle in his hands. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but absolutely clear. 6 months ago, my wife was dying. You all knew it, the whole town knew it, and not one person showed up to help, not with meals, not with work, not with anything that mattered. You prayed for us. Thanks for that, real useful, but you didn't do a damn thing that required effort or sacrifice. He took a step forward, and the men actually stepped back. Last week, I had 7 fence posts that needed setting before the Department of Agriculture shut me down. I asked 4 different people from town to help me for fair wages. Every single one found an excuse. But Lena Crow, who you're also concerned about, she dug holes until her hands bled. She worked through pain that would have put any of you on your asses. She didn't ask for special treatment, didn't complain, didn't quit. Ethan lowered the rifle, but somehow looked more dangerous. So yeah, Reverend, she's worth it. She's worth more than every signature on that bullshit petition. And if you want to come after me through the county or the bank or whatever other power you think you have, you go right ahead, but you're leaving my property now and you're not coming back. The standoff lasted maybe 10 seconds, but it felt like hours. Finally, Sheriff Walsh held up his hands in a placating gesture. All right, Ethan, we hear you. We're going. He glanced at the other men. Come on. They loaded back into their trucks, but Merrick paused before getting in. This isn't over, he called out. You can't stand against the whole town. Watch me, Ethan replied. The trucks pulled away, their red taillights disappearing into the darkness, leaving Ethan and Lena alone under a sky full of stars that didn't care about petitions or property lines or any of it. Ethan stood there for a long moment, still holding the rifle, his shoulders rigid with tension that hadn't released yet. You didn't have to do that, Lena said quietly. Yeah, I did. They'll come after you now. They'll make things hard. They already made things hard by being useless when I needed them. He finally turned to look at her. You earned your place here, Lena. They didn't. That's all that matters. They strung the wire the next morning, working in silence heavier than the rolls of barbed fencing they carried between posts. Ethan's hands moved with practiced efficiency, pulling the wire taut, securing it with U-staples that bit deep into the wooden posts. Lena followed his lead, learning as she went, her bandaged hands clumsy but determined. The work should have felt triumphant. They were finishing what they'd started, completing the fence that would save Ethan's herd and buy him time with the Department of Agriculture. But the confrontation from the night before hung over them like storm clouds that wouldn't break. "You think they'll actually do it?" Lena asked, stretching wire between two posts while Ethan hammered staples. "Go after your exemptions and loans?" "Merrick will try. Whether he succeeds depends on how much sway he actually has versus how much he thinks he has." Ethan struck the staple with more force than necessary. "Man's been running this town like his personal kingdom for 15 years. Doesn't take kindly to being told no." "I could leave. Before it gets worse." Ethan stopped hammering, turning to look at her with an expression that was part frustration, part something else she couldn't name. "Is that what you want?" "What I want doesn't matter much. It matters to me." He set the hammer down. "Look, I didn't bring you here out of charity. I brought you here because I needed help and you needed work. That's a fair exchange. But somewhere in the last 3 days, it stopped being just about the fence." Lena waited, not sure where this was going. "I sleep better knowing someone else is in the house," Ethan continued, the words coming out rough like they hurt to say. "I eat actual meals because I have to cook for 2 instead of just heating up whatever's quick. The work gets done faster, yeah, but it's more than that. It's—" He stopped, searching for words. "It's less lonely." "I know what you mean," Lena said quietly. "So if you're asking if you should leave to make things easier for me, the answer's no. You stay, we deal with whatever comes." He picked up the hammer again. "Unless you want to leave. That's different." "I don't want to leave." "Good. Then that's settled." But Lena knew it wasn't settled. Not by a long shot. Towns like Grafton's Edge didn't forget slights, and Ethan had delivered one hell of a slight when he refused to bend to Merrick's petition. They finished the fence by early afternoon, standing back to survey their work. 7 new posts stood solid and straight, wire pulled tight between them, creating a barrier that would keep Ethan's cattle on the right side of the property line. It wasn't pretty. The wood was mismatched, the wire had kinks from being rolled too long, but it was functional. It would hold. "We should celebrate," Ethan said suddenly. "Celebrate how?" "Town's having their monthly market tomorrow. We need supplies anyway, feed, salt blocks, couple other things. Figure we'll drive in, get what we need, maybe grab lunch at May's Diner." He looked at her. "Show them we're not hiding." Lena's stomach dropped. "That's a terrible idea. Probably. But if we don't go, if we act like we're ashamed or scared, it gives them power they don't deserve." Ethan started loading tools into the truck bed. "Besides, I'm out of coffee. That's non-negotiable." The drive back to the cabin felt different this time. Lighter somehow, despite the tension waiting for them in town. They'd accomplished something real, something that would last. Lena found herself looking at the land with new eyes, not as endless emptiness, but as something with purpose, with potential. That night, Ethan pulled a bottle of whiskey from the cabinet, the good stuff that had probably been saved for special occasions that never came. He poured 2 glasses, sliding one across the table to Lena. "To fixing things that were broken," he said, raising his glass. Lena raised hers. "To not dying in the dirt." They drank, the whiskey burning clean and harsh. Lena hadn't had alcohol in months, and it hit her system like a freight train, warmth spreading through her chest and limbs. "Sarah and I used to do this every time we finished a big project," Ethan said, pouring himself another measure. "New barn roof, fence repairs, getting the hay in before rain. She'd make dinner, I'd break out the whiskey, and we'd sit right here talking until midnight about what to do next." "What would you do next?" "Usually something stupid that cost more money than we had." He smiled, but it was sad around the edges. "Sarah had big dreams, wanted to expand the herd, maybe get into breeding quality stock, wanted to build a proper guest house so family could visit. Not that we had much family, but she was optimistic like that." "Sounds like she was good for you." "She was good, period. I was just lucky she didn't figure that out before we got married." Ethan stared into his glass. "You know what the worst part is? I can't remember the last conversation we had before she got the diagnosis. I've tried and tried, but it's just gone. Whatever we talked about that morning, whatever stupid thing I said, it's erased. But I remember every word of every fight we ever had. Funny how memory works." Lena understood that better than he knew. She could remember in perfect detail every time Marcus had hit her, every word he'd screamed, every moment of fear. But she couldn't remember what had made her fall for him in the first place. Couldn't recall a single happy moment from before everything turned dark. "My ex used to tell me I was worthless," she said, surprising herself. The whiskey was loosening her tongue. Said I was lucky he stayed with me because nobody else would want damaged goods. After a while, I started believing him, started thinking maybe I deserved it. Ethan looked at her, really looked at her, his eyes sharp despite the alcohol. "You know that's bullshit, right? Knowing and believing are different things." "Yeah, they are." He refilled both their glasses. "But for what it's worth, you're not worthless. You're stubborn as hell, tougher than you look, and you don't quit when things get hard. That's worth something." It wasn't a declaration of friendship or affection, just a simple statement of observed fact. Somehow that made it mean more. They talked until the bottle was half empty and the stars were bright overhead. Talked about everything and nothing. Ethan's childhood on the ranch, Lena's dreams of being a teacher before life got complicated, the way small towns could nurture you or strangle you depending on whether you fit their idea of acceptable. When Lena finally stumbled to her small room, the world pleasantly fuzzy at the edges, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the desperate, clawing hope of someone drowning, but the quiet kind that comes from having solid ground under your feet. Morning arrived with a vengeance, sunlight stabbing through the window like accusation. Lena's head pounded from the whiskey, and her body reminded her that 3 days of hard labor couldn't be erased by one night of drinking. But they had a trip to town, and avoiding it would only make things worse. She found Ethan already dressed, looking rough but functional. He handed her a cup of coffee without comment, and they both drank in silence, preparing themselves for whatever was coming. The drive to Grafton's Edge took 20 minutes, the truck rattling over washboard roads that hadn't seen maintenance in years. As they got closer, Lena felt her chest tightening, anxiety creeping in despite her resolve to stand tall. "Stay close to me," Ethan said, pulling into a parking spot near the market square. "Don't engage if someone starts something. Just keep walking. What if they don't let us keep walking? Then we'll deal with it." He killed the engine. "Ready?" Lena wasn't, but she nodded anyway. The monthly market was in full swing, farmers selling produce, craftspeople hawking handmade goods, families browsing with children in tow. It should have been pleasant, communal, the kind of small-town charm people wrote songs about. But the moment Ethan and Lena stepped into the square, conversation stopped. Heads turned. Whispers started like wildfire catching dry grass. "Just keep walking," Ethan murmured. They made their way to the feed store first, Ethan's boots hitting the wooden sidewalk with purpose. Inside, old Frank Morrison was working the register, his weathered face neutral as they approached. "Ethan," Frank said by way of greeting. "Frank, need 3 bags of cattle feed, 2 salt blocks." "Sure thing." Frank started ringing it up, then glanced at Lena. "Ma'am." It was the first time anyone from town had acknowledged her as a person instead of a problem. Lena managed a nod in return. "That'll be $86, Frank said. Ethan paid cash, and Frank loaded the bags into the truck without comment. As they left, Lena heard him tell someone behind them, "Man's business is his own. Y'all should remember that." Small victories. They were heading toward May's diner when Reverend Merrick appeared, flanked by 2 of the men from the night before. He positioned himself directly in their path, forcing them to either stop or walk around him. Ethan stopped. "Reverend," he said flatly. "I was hoping we might talk," Merrick said, his voice carrying that false warmth he probably used for sermons. "Clear the air. Find some common ground. Don't have much to talk about. You came to my property uninvited, made threats, got told to leave. That about covers it." A crowd was gathering now, people abandoning their market browsing to watch the confrontation. Lena felt dozens of eyes on her, judging, calculating, finding her wanting. "I came out of concern for your well-being," Merrick continued. "And I still am concerned, Ethan. You're making choices that could have serious consequences." "Like what? Standing up for myself? Not letting you dictate who I can have on my own land? Like defying the community that supported you your whole life?" Merrick's voice had hardened. "We're not your enemies, Ethan. We want what's best for everyone, including you." "Then why does what's best always seem to involve controlling what I do?" Sheriff Walsh appeared from somewhere in the crowd, moving to stand near Merrick. His presence shifted the dynamic immediately. This wasn't just a religious leader making his case. This was law enforcement backing him up. "Ethan," Walsh said carefully, "maybe we should take this somewhere private." "Why? So you can threaten me where there's no witnesses?" Ethan's voice was rising now. "Everything you've got to say, you can say right here." Merrick pulled out that damned petition again, holding it up like evidence in a trial. 43 signatures now. 43 concerned citizens who believe Miss Crow represents a danger to this community. That's more than half the adults in Grafton's Edge. 43 people who'll sign anything you tell them to, Ethan shot back. How many of them have actually talked to Lena? How many know a single thing about her besides the stories you've been spreading? We know she was living on the streets. We know she has no employment history here, no references, no ties to anyone. We know... You know nothing. Ethan took a step forward, and several people in the crowd actually gasped. You assume, you judge, you condemn, but you don't know. Margaret Chen pushed her way to the front of the crowd, her face flushed with righteous anger. "I know she sat outside my shop begging for handouts instead of trying to find honest work." "I tried," Lena said quietly. The words slipped out before she could stop them. Everyone turned to look at her. Ethan shot her a warning glance, but it was too late. She'd spoken, and now silence felt worse than continuing. "I tried finding work," Lena said louder, her voice shaking but steady. "I asked at the hotel, the diner, the grocery store, the feed shop. I asked everyone. Nobody was hiring, or at least nobody was hiring me." "That's because you're not hireable," someone called from the crowd. "Look at you." "Yeah, look at me now. Clean clothes, fed, working. Funny how that happens when someone actually gives you a chance instead of assuming you're trash." Merrick's expression darkened. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. Disrespect, hostility, someone with her background." "What background?" Lena interrupted, anger overriding fear now. "You don't know anything about my background. You made up a story about who I am and decided it was true. We know enough. You know I was sitting behind Murphy's store starving. That's all you know. You don't know why. You don't know what brought me there. You just decided I must have deserved it, because that's easier than admitting you all walked past a human being in need and did nothing." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some faces showed shame, others anger, most just confusion. "I was married to a man who beat me," Lena continued, the words pouring out like poison she needed to expel. "I left with nothing because staying meant dying. I worked every job I could find, but he kept finding me, kept getting me fired. I ended up here because I thought maybe in a small town, people would help each other. I was wrong." "That's a sad story," Merrick said, his tone making it clear he didn't believe a word. "But it doesn't change the fact that you're a vagrant with no ties to this community, no accountability to anyone. You could rob Ethan blind and disappear tomorrow." "I could," Lena agreed. "But I won't, because Ethan Hale did more for me in one day than this entire town did in 2 months. He gave me work, gave me dignity, gave me a reason to keep going. And if you can't understand why that makes me loyal, then you're not half as Christian as you pretend to be." The Reverend's face went red. "How dare you? No, how dare you?" Lena was shouting now, all the fear and anger and humiliation of the past months erupting at once. "How dare you stand there with your petition and your judgment, acting like you're protecting this community, when all you're really doing is protecting your own sense of superiority? You need people like me to look down on. You need someone to be worse than you so you can feel good about yourselves." "That's enough," Walsh said, his hand moving toward his belt. "Yeah, it is enough." Ethan stepped between Lena and the sheriff. "We came here to buy supplies and have lunch. If you want to arrest us for that, go ahead. Otherwise, get out of our way." The standoff lasted 10 seconds that felt like an hour. The crowd was completely silent, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. Walsh's hand moved away from his belt. "No laws being broken yet." "Then we're done here." Ethan took Lena's arm gently. "Come on." They walked toward May's diner, the crowd parting reluctantly to let them through. Lena could feel the weight of all those eyes, all that judgment, but she kept her head up and kept walking. Inside the diner, May herself stood behind the counter, a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and eyes that didn't miss much. She looked at Ethan and Lena, then at the crowd visible through the window, then back at them. "Two for lunch?" she asked. "Please," Ethan said. May grabbed 2 menus and led them to a booth in the back, away from the windows. "Chicken fried steak's the special today. Coffee's fresh." "Thanks, May." She paused, looking at Lena directly. "You the one been staying out at Ethan's place?" Here it comes, Lena thought. Another judgment, another rejection. "Yes, ma'am." May nodded slowly. "Good. Boy needs someone around. Been worried about him out there alone." She glanced at Ethan. Sarah would have liked her. Girl's got spine. She walked away before either of them could respond. Lena felt tears threatening but pushed them back. One moment of kindness shouldn't hit this hard, but it did. "You okay?" Ethan asked. "I shouldn't have said all that, out there. I made it worse." "You spoke the truth. That's not making it worse. That's just shining a light on what was already there." He studied the menu even though they both knew he ordered the same thing every time. Besides, they were going to come after us anyway. Might as well have your say first. They ordered lunch, chicken fried steak for Ethan, a burger for Lena. The food arrived quickly, May bringing it herself instead of sending her usual waitress. "Don't mind them," May said, setting down the plates. "Small towns are like this. Change scares people. You two being out there together, not following the script they expect. It makes them nervous." "We're not doing anything wrong," Lena said. "I know that. And deep down, most of them know it too. But knowing and admitting are different things." May refilled their coffee cups. "Give it time. Either they'll come around or they won't. Either way, you'll survive it." The diner door opened and more people filed in. Market shoppers looking for lunch. They saw Ethan and Lena in the back booth and most quickly looked away, choosing tables as far from them as possible. But one woman didn't. She was maybe 30, wearing jeans and a work shirt, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She walked straight to their booth. "Ethan Hale?" she said. Ethan looked up warily. "Yeah?" "Jennifer Torres. I run the tack shop on Elm Street." She extended her hand, and after a moment, Ethan shook it. "I heard what happened out there. Just wanted to say, I think Merrick's full of shit." Ethan blinked, surprised. "Appreciate that." Jennifer glanced at Lena. "I remember you. You came to my shop asking about work, 6 weeks ago?" Lena nodded, not trusting her voice. "I told you I wasn't hiring, but truth is, I could have used help. I was just—" She paused, looking uncomfortable. "I was scared. Scared of what people would think, scared of getting involved. That was wrong. I'm sorry." "It's okay," Lena managed. "It's not, but I appreciate you saying so." Jennifer straightened up. "Anyway, if Merrick or Walsh give you more trouble, there's a few of us who think this whole thing is ridiculous. You're not alone." She walked away before they could respond, choosing a table near the front. "Huh," Ethan said. "Huh," Lena agreed. They ate in relative peace, though Lena could feel the tension in the room like electricity before a storm. Every few minutes, someone would glance their way, whisper to their companion, create small ripples of attention that never quite broke into open confrontation. They were finishing their meal when the door opened again and Merrick walked in, followed by Walsh and 2 other men Lena recognized from the midnight visit to Ethan's ranch. They didn't sit down, they just stood near the entrance, creating a presence that couldn't be ignored. May appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "You boys eating or just blocking my door?" "We're here on official business," Walsh said. "Official business is having lunch in my diner?" May's voice had an edge Lena hadn't heard before. "Move aside or order something. You're bad for business standing there like that." Merrick ignored her, his eyes locked on Ethan. "We've filed a formal complaint with the county. They'll be sending an inspector out to your ranch within the week. Any code violations, any safety issues, anything that gives them cause, and trust me, they'll find cause, your agricultural exemption will be revoked." "You're threatening me with inspections?" Ethan laughed, but it was bitter. "That's your big move?" "It's a start." Merrick stepped further into the diner, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "You want to stand against this community, Ethan? Fine. But don't expect us to make it easy." That ranch of yours exists on tax breaks and county support. We can make those things disappear. We can make sure nobody from Grafton's Edge works for you, sells to you, or buys from you. We can isolate you completely." The diner had gone silent. Everyone was watching now, no longer pretending to mind their own business. Ethan stood slowly, putting himself between Merrick and Lena. "You finished?" "Not even close. This is just the beginning. By the time we're done, you'll wish you'd listened to reason back when we were being friendly. Your version of friendly involves midnight ambushes and threatening letters. I'll pass, thanks." Merrick's face had gone purple. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life." "Probably not even in my top 5, Ethan said. "Now get out of this diner before May calls the actual law, not just Walsh playing dress-up." Sheriff Walsh stiffened. "Watch yourself, Hale." "Or what? You'll arrest me for eating lunch? Go ahead. I'd love to explain to a county judge why Grafton's Edge law enforcement is harassing citizens for having house guests." They stared at each other, and for a moment Lena thought it would actually turn violent, that Walsh would make a move, that Ethan would fight back, that everything would explode right there in May's diner over chicken fried steak and bad coffee. But May stepped between them, all 5'3" of her, holding a cast iron skillet she'd grabbed from somewhere. "Out," she said simply. "All of you. Now." Merrick looked at her in disbelief. "You can't. It's my diner. I can refuse service to anyone I damn well please. And right now, I'm refusing service to you 4. Get out before I use this skillet for something other than cornbread." The men exchanged glances, calculating whether this was a fight worth having. Apparently it wasn't, because Merrick turned and walked out, the others following. The door closed behind them, and slowly conversation resumed in the diner, though everyone was clearly still listening. May set the skillet down on the counter with a decisive clang. "Your meals are on the house today. Consider it an investment in watching Merrick's face turn that particular shade of red." "May, you didn't have to," Ethan started. "I know I didn't have to. I wanted to." She crossed her arms. "That man's been running this town like his personal fiefdom for too long. About time someone pushed back." They left the diner 20 minutes later, Ethan insisting on paying despite May's protest. Outside, the market was still going, but the atmosphere had changed. People weren't just staring anymore. They were choosing sides. Some faces were hostile, making their position clear, but others looked uncertain, like maybe they were starting to question Merrick's narrative. And a few, like Jennifer Torres, who nodded as they passed her shop, looked almost supportive. "That went about as well as expected," Ethan said as they loaded the last of their supplies into the truck. "Better, actually. I thought we'd get run out completely. Day's not over yet." But they made it to the truck without further confrontation, climbing in and starting the engine. As they pulled away from Grafton's Edge, Lena looked back at the town in the side mirror, watching it shrink into the distance. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now they come after me however they can. Inspections, complaints, pressure on my bank. Merrick's got pull with some of the county officials. Won't be enough to destroy me outright, but he can make things difficult. I'm sorry." "Don't be. This was coming anyway." Ethan kept his eyes on the road. "Sarah used to tell me I was too stubborn for my own good, said it would get me in trouble someday. Guess she was right. Would she have approved of me staying, I mean?" Ethan thought about that for a long moment. "Yeah, she would have. Sarah believed in giving people chances and seeing the best in folks even when they couldn't see it themselves. She would have looked at you and seen potential, same as I do." The compliment hit Lena harder than she expected, warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the afternoon heat. They drove in comfortable silence, the ranch appearing on the horizon like refuge, like home. When they pulled up to the cabin, everything looked exactly as they'd left it. The barn still leaning, the fence line visible in the distance, the land stretching away in all directions. But something had shifted. This wasn't just Ethan's place anymore. It was theirs, together. A small piece of earth that the world couldn't take away, no matter how hard Grafton's Edge tried. "Tomorrow we start on the barn roof," Ethan said, killing the engine. "Been putting it off for months, but if inspectors are coming, I need everything in working order." "Together?" "Together." They unloaded the supplies as the sun began its descent, working side by side like they'd been doing this for years instead of days. And when they finally went inside and Ethan poured them each a glass of water, Lena realized something fundamental had changed. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was building. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, tomorrow didn't feel like something to endure but something to work toward. Whatever Grafton's Edge threw at them, they'd face it. Together. The county inspector arrived on a Thursday morning, 3 days after Merrick's threat in the diner. Lena saw the official vehicle coming from a mile away, dust trailing behind it like a banner announcing trouble. "They're here," she called to Ethan, who was up on the barn roof replacing shingles they'd spent the past 2 days tearing off. Ethan climbed down the ladder, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Right on schedule. Merrick doesn't waste time." The inspector was a man in his 50s wearing khaki pants and a polo shirt with the county seal embroidered on the chest. He carried a clipboard and had the expression of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. "Ethan Hale?" he asked, though he clearly already knew. "That's me. Robert Chen, County Agricultural Compliance. I'm here to conduct a routine inspection of your operation." He glanced at Lena briefly, dismissed her as irrelevant, then turned back to Ethan. "This should take a few hours. I'll need access to all structures, livestock areas, and equipment." "Routine inspection," Ethan repeated. "Funny timing, seeing as I've been running this place for 20 years without a single routine inspection." Chen's expression didn't change. "New policies. We're conducting reviews of all agricultural exemptions in the county. You're not being singled out." "Sure I'm not." Ethan gestured toward the barn. "Where you want to start?" For the next 3 hours, Chen went through the ranch with methodical precision. He measured fence heights, checked water quality in the cattle troughs, inspected the barn's structural integrity, reviewed Ethan's record-keeping, and photographed everything. Lena watched from a distance, seeing the way Chen would pause at anything that looked even slightly questionable, making notes on his clipboard. "Your northern fence line," Chen said, standing at the site of their recent repair work. "This was just completed?" 4 days ago, Ethan confirmed. "Posts aren't regulation depth. They're 3 feet deep. That's standard. Standard for residential fencing. Agricultural requires 3.5 for cattle operations of your size." Chen made a note. "You'll need to correct that. Those posts are holding 200 pounds of cattle pressure just fine. They're not going anywhere. That's not the regulation." More notes. "I'll be citing this in my report." It went on like that, finding minor violations, questionable interpretations of code, things that had been acceptable for decades suddenly becoming problems. The barn roof needed to be a specific grade of shingle. The cattle loading chute was 6 inches narrower than current specifications. The water heater in the cabin wasn't properly vented according to updated residential codes that technically applied to agricultural properties. By the time Chen finished, his clipboard was covered in notes. "I'll submit my findings to the county board," he said, walking back to his vehicle. "You'll receive a formal notice within 10 business days outlining required corrections and timeline for compliance. Failure to meet those requirements will result in revocation of your agricultural exemption." "How much is this going to cost?" Ethan asked. "That's not my concern. My job is compliance, not budgeting." Chen opened his car door. "You have 30 days from date of notice to complete all corrections. I'll be back to verify." He drove away, leaving Ethan and Lena standing in the yard watching the dust settle. 30 days, Lena said quietly, "to do work that'll cost thousands I don't have." Ethan's jaw was tight. Merrick knew exactly what he was doing. "Even if I fight the citations, the legal fees alone would bankrupt me." "What if we do the work ourselves? The fence posts, the roof, whatever else?" "Some of it, maybe. But bringing the water heater up to code requires a licensed contractor. Same with the electrical work he's going to cite once his report comes through. And licensed contractors cost money I literally don't have." They walked back to the cabin in silence. Inside, Ethan pulled out a folder of financial documents and spread them across the kitchen table. Bank statements, loan papers, bills stacked in ominous piles. "Let me see where I'm at," he said, more to himself than Lena. She sat across from him, watching him calculate and recalculate numbers that clearly didn't add up, no matter how he arranged them. His face grew harder with each pass through the papers. "Okay," he finally said. "I've got maybe $2,000 in savings. The loan payment's due in 3 weeks. That's $1,200 right there. Electric bill, insurance, feed costs, that's another 800, which leaves me exactly nothing for repairs, let alone hiring contractors. What about selling some cattle? Market's down. I'd have to sell at least 10 head to make enough, and that's assuming I can find a buyer quickly. Even then, I'd be cutting into next year's breeding stock. He rubbed his face with both hands. I'm screwed. Merrick's got me cornered. Lena looked at the papers spread across the table, at the careful records Sarah and Ethan had kept for years, at a lifetime of work being dismantled by bureaucratic precision. Something hot and angry coiled in her chest. No, she said. Ethan looked up. No what? No, you're not screwed. We're not letting them win like this. She stood up, pacing the small kitchen. There has to be something. Someone who'll help, some way to fight back. Lena, I appreciate the optimism, but don't do that. Don't give up because the first obstacle looks too big. She stopped pacing, facing him directly. You told me 3 days ago that I earned my place here by not quitting. So don't you quit either. It's not quitting if there's legitimately no way forward. There's always a way forward. It might be ugly, it might hurt, but there's always something. Lena sat back down. What about a loan extension or borrowing against the property? Already maxed out. The bank won't extend more credit, and I'm barely making the current payments. Ethan gathered the papers back into their folder. This ranch has been in my family for 3 generations. It's going to die with me because I couldn't keep it together after Sarah left. Sarah didn't leave. She died. There's a difference. Feels the same from where I'm sitting. The defeat in his voice made Lena want to scream. She'd watched this man stand up to an entire town, face down threats, work himself to exhaustion, and now he was folding because of inspection reports and budget shortfalls. Tomorrow we're going back to town, she said. Why? So they can gloat? So we can find allies. Jennifer Torres said there were others who thought Merrick was wrong. May kicked him out of her diner. There are people who don't want to see you lose this place. Even if that's true, they're not going to hand me thousands of dollars. Maybe not, but maybe they'll help in other ways. Discounts on materials, labor exchanges, something. Lena leaned forward. Or maybe we go over Merrick's head. File a complaint about harassment, about him using county resources for personal vendettas. You think anyone will listen? I think it's worth trying before we surrender. Ethan studied her for a long moment. When did you get so damn stubborn? Learned from the best. That night, Lena barely slept. Her mind spun with possibilities and problems, trying to find angles that Ethan couldn't see through his exhaustion and grief. By the time dawn broke, she had something resembling a plan. She found Ethan already up, staring at his coffee like it held answers. We're going to see May first, Lena said, then Jennifer Torres, then anyone else in town who doesn't worship at Merrick's feet. And say what? The truth, that this inspection is retaliation, that Merrick's abusing his influence, and that if they let him destroy you, they're next whenever they step out of line. She poured herself coffee. Small towns work on relationships, right? Time to build some. Ethan looked skeptical, but didn't argue. An hour later, they were back in Grafton's Edge, parking outside May's diner before it opened for breakfast service. May answered their knock, looking surprised to see them. Little early for lunch. We need to talk, Ethan said, about Merrick and what's happening. May's expression sharpened. Come in. Inside, with the chairs still stacked on tables, Ethan explained the inspection, the citations, the impossible timeline, and costs. May listened without interrupting, her weathered hands wrapped around her own coffee mug. Bastard, she said when Ethan finished. That sneaky, righteous bastard. He's been planning this since you stood up to him. I know. Question is, what do I do about it? Fight back, publicly. May set down her mug with decisive force. You let him do this in secret, he wins. But if people know what's happening, if they see how he's manipulating county resources, some of them will care. Some won't. Some won't, May agreed. But you don't need everyone. You need enough. She stood up. I'll talk to people. Let them know what's really going on. You two go see Jennifer. Girl's got connections in the county office. Might know someone who can slow this down or at least make it fair. They found Jennifer at her tack shop, already open despite the early hour. When they explained the situation, her face went through several expressions before settling on anger. "He really filed a formal complaint just to trigger an inspection?" she asked. "That's how it works," Ethan confirmed. "Anonymous complaint. County has to investigate. Merrick knows every loophole." Jennifer walked to her office in the back, returning with her phone. "My cousin works in the county planning department. Not the same division, but she knows people. Let me make some calls." While Jennifer worked her phone, Ethan and Lena waited in the shop, surrounded by saddles and bridles and the smell of leather. Lena watched through the window as Grafton's Edge came to life. Shops opening, people starting their day, the normal rhythms of a small town that had no idea a quiet war was being fought. Jennifer emerged 20 minutes later, her expression grim but determined. "Okay, so the inspection was definitely triggered by a complaint. My cousin can't tell me who filed it officially, but the timing makes it obvious. The citations Chen wrote up, she says about half of them are legitimate code issues. The other half are borderline or interpretative." "Meaning?" Ethan asked. "Meaning you could fight them if you had a lawyer and time. But the 30-day deadline makes fighting impractical." Jennifer leaned against the counter. "Here's the thing, though. She says Chen's known for being overly thorough. He doesn't usually nail people this hard unless there's pressure from above. Can she prove that?" "Not officially, but she can make noise, ask questions, maybe get his supervisor to review the citations. Won't stop the clock, but might buy you some wiggle room." It wasn't much, but it was something. Ethan nodded slowly. "Appreciate it. Don't thank me yet. I'm not done." Jennifer grabbed a business card from behind the register. "This is Tom Brennan. He does electrical work, licensed contractor, the whole deal. He's also my uncle, and he owes me a favor. I'll call him, see if he'll do your work at cost." "Jennifer, save it. I told you, some of us think this is bullshit. Time to prove it." She started dialing. "You two go keep talking to people. The more who know what's happening, the harder it is for Merrick to spin this as routine compliance." By noon, they'd talked to 8 different people, shop owners, farmers who sold at the market, even Frank Morrison from the feed store. The responses were mixed. Some were sympathetic but unwilling to get involved. Others were openly supportive but unsure what they could do. A few suggested Ethan just comply and move on. But 3 people offered tangible help. A hardware store owner agreed to sell materials at cost. A retired carpenter said he'd help with the barn roof for free. And May organized a meeting for that evening at her diner. Anyone interested in discussing community support in difficult times, she called it. Ethan seemed stunned by the responses. "I didn't think anyone would care." "You didn't ask," Lena pointed out. "You've been handling everything alone for so long, you forgot people might actually want to help. Most of them still won't. Most isn't all." The meeting that evening drew 15 people, more than Lena expected, fewer than they needed. May had arranged the tables in a circle, creating the illusion of equality and openness. Reverend Merrick wasn't there, notably, though Sheriff Walsh sat in the back corner looking uncomfortable. May started things off. "We all know why we're here. Ethan Hale's being targeted by someone using county regulations as a weapon. I think that's wrong, and I think some of you agree, so let's figure out how to help." "Help how?" someone asked. "The man's got citations. He has to fix them." "At costs he can't afford," May countered. "Costs that wouldn't exist if this was actually about safety instead of revenge." "That's a serious accusation," Walsh said from the back. "You got proof?" "I've got timing. I've got a county inspector who suddenly finds problems that have existed for 20 years. I've got common sense." May crossed her arms. "Don't insult our intelligence, Jim. We all know what this is." The room shifted uncomfortably. People exchanged glances, calculations happening behind their eyes about which side to land on. Then Jennifer stood up. "I'll contribute $200 toward materials, and my uncle's doing the electrical work at cost. Anyone else want to step up?" Silence, heavy and awkward. Lena felt her chest tighten. This was it. The moment where Grafton's Edge decided whether they were a community or just a collection of people who happened to live near each other. Then Frank Morrison cleared his throat. "I'll knock 20% off his feed costs for the next 6 months. It's not much, but it's something." "I can donate tools," the retired carpenter offered. "Got more than I need anyway." One by one, small offers came forward. $100 here, free labor there, discounts and donations that individually seem meaningless but collectively added up to something real. Not everyone contributed. Some sat silent, unwilling to commit. But by the end of the hour, they'd raised nearly $1,000 in cash and pledges, plus significant labor help. "This doesn't solve everything," Ethan said, his voice rough with emotion he was trying to hide. "But it helps. More than you know." "Then let's make sure Merrick knows what we're doing," May said. "Let's make this public. Put it in the county newsletter, post it around town. Community supports local rancher. Show him he doesn't speak for all of us." Walsh stood up then, everyone turning to look at him. "I can't stop the inspection process. That's county jurisdiction. But I can make sure nobody's rights are being violated during it. And I can have a conversation with my friends in the county office about what constitutes legitimate enforcement versus harassment." It wasn't a ringing endorsement, but coming from Walsh, it was significant. The sheriff was hedging his bets, keeping one foot on each side of the divide. The meeting broke up around 9, people filing out into the night with promises to follow through on their pledges. Ethan stood near the door, shaking hands, accepting support that clearly made him uncomfortable, but that he needed too desperately to refuse. When only May, Jennifer, and Lena remained, May poured them all whiskey from a bottle she kept under the counter. "To small victories," she said, raising her glass. They drank, the liquor burning warm and fortifying. "He's going to retaliate," Jennifer said. "Merrick, I mean. He'll see this as open rebellion." "Let him," May replied. "Man can't excommunicate the whole town." "Can't he? He's got 43 signatures saying otherwise." Had 43 signatures. I'm guessing after tonight, a few of those people might be having second thoughts. Lena hoped May was right, but she knew how these things worked. Publicly supporting Ethan was one thing when it was abstract. Actually standing against Merrick when the pressure came, that would be the real test. They drove home under a sky so thick with stars it looked like someone had punched holes in black canvas. Ethan was quiet, processing everything that had happened. "Thank you," he said finally, "for pushing me to go back, for not letting me give up." "You would have done the same for me." "Maybe. Or maybe I would have just accepted that some fights can't be won." He glanced at her. "You're stronger than I gave you credit for." "I'm stubborn. There's a difference." "Is there?" They worked for the next 2 weeks with renewed purpose, using the donated materials and helped to tackle the citation list. Tom Brennan came out and brought the water heater up to code for half his usual rate. The retired carpenter spent 3 days on the barn roof, teaching Lena and Ethan proper shingling technique while sharing stories about building half the houses in Grafton's Edge. The fence posts were trickier. Digging them another 6 inches meant redoing work they'd already completed. But with help from 2 farmers who showed up unannounced one Saturday, they managed to meet the regulation depth without destroying the existing fence line. Money remained tight, stretched impossibly thin, but the community support meant Ethan wasn't drowning quite as fast. Every day brought small progress, small victories that added up to staying alive a little longer. But Merrick wasn't idle. Lena started noticing changes in town. Shops that had been friendly suddenly weren't. People who'd pledged support at May's meeting now avoided eye contact when Ethan came in to buy supplies. The pressure was subtle but constant, Merrick working behind the scenes to remind people where their true loyalties should lie. Then the letter arrived. Official county letterhead, certified mail, requiring signature. Ethan opened it at the kitchen table while Lena watched, both of them knowing it couldn't be good news. His face went pale as he read. "What is it?" Lena asked. "The bank. They're calling in my loan, all of it, due in full within 90 days. Can they do that? If they claim I'm in material breach of terms, yeah. It says here there's been concerns raised about the viability of my operation, the pending citation corrections, questions about my ability to maintain adequate collateral value." He set the letter down carefully, like it might explode. "This is Merrick. He's on the bank's board of trustees. So fight it. Get a lawyer. File a complaint. With what money, Lena? I can barely make the current payments. A lawyer would cost thousands I don't have, and even if I fight and win, the legal fees would destroy me anyway." Ethan stood up, walked to the window, stared out at the land he was about to lose. "It's over. He won." "No." Lena stood up too, anger flooding through her so hot it felt like fire. No, he doesn't get to win. Not like this. There's no other way this ends. Then we make one. Lena was pacing now, her mind racing through possibilities. What if we go public, really public? Not just Grafton's Edge, regional papers, news stations, social media. Make this a story about a small-town reverend using his power to destroy someone who stood up to him. That's a scorched earth strategy. It'll make enemies of everyone. We already have enemies. At least this way we fight back. She stopped pacing, facing him directly. You told me you almost burned this place down after Sarah died. Said you thought about walking away. Is this really how you want to lose it? On your knees, begging Merrick for mercy he'll never give? Ethan's jaw worked, emotions fighting across his face. If we do this, there's no going back. This town will never forgive us. This town already decided who we are. Time to show them they're wrong. For a long moment, Ethan didn't respond. Then slowly, something hardened in his expression. The same look he'd had when he stood up to Merrick in the market square, when he'd refused to back down in the diner. Okay, he said. Let's burn it down. They started with Jennifer's cousin in the county office. She couldn't give them official documentation. That would cost her job, but she could point them toward public records that told the story Ethan and Lena needed to tell. Complaint filed against Ethan Hale on the same day as the diner confrontation. Inspector assigned within 48 hours, unusually fast for routine agricultural reviews. The complainant listed as anonymous, but the complaint form itself filled out on county letterhead, accessible only to board members and certain officials. Merrick's fingerprints are all over this, Jennifer's cousin said, sliding copies of the forms across her desk. I can't testify to that officially, but anyone with eyes can see it. What about the bank? Lena asked. Can you trace that connection? The bank's private, but Merrick's been on their board for 12 years, and his signature's on the letter demanding payment. That's public record once it's filed. She tapped the documents. You put this together, right? It tells a clear story about abuse of power. Ethan gathered the papers carefully. This could blow back on you. I'm aware, but I'm also tired of watching people like Merrick run roughshod over anyone who doesn't fall in line. She stood, signaling the meeting was over. Just don't mention where you got the information. Say you filed a public records request and did your own digging. They spent the next 2 days organizing everything into a coherent narrative. Lena worked on the writing. She'd been an English major for 2 years before life derailed her education, while Ethan handled the documentation. Together, they crafted a story that was factual, damning, and impossible to ignore. Local rancher targeted by vindictive religious leader. County resources weaponized for personal vendetta. Small-town corruption at its finest. Where do we send this? Ethan asked, reading through Lena's draft. Everywhere. Regional papers, TV stations in the nearest city, online news sites that cover rural issues. Lena was making a list. And we post it ourselves on social media. Make it impossible to contain. You know this might not work. Even if people care, they might not care enough. Then at least we go down fighting instead of just rolling over. They hit send on a Thursday afternoon. Emails flying to 20 different media outlets. Posts going live on every platform Lena could access from the cabin's spotty internet connection. Then they waited. Nothing happened the first day. Or the second. Lena started to think maybe they'd miscalculated, that nobody cared about a small-town land dispute, that their story would die in the vast noise of the internet. Then on Saturday morning, a reporter from the state's largest newspaper called. She'd seen their story shared on a rural advocacy group's page, and she wanted to talk. Her name was Sarah Kim, which made Ethan flinch when she introduced herself. She drove out to the ranch that afternoon with a photographer, asking pointed questions while taking notes on everything Ethan and Lena said. You have proof of Merrick's involvement? Kim asked. Ethan showed her the documents, the timeline of the complaint, the inspection, the bank letter with Merrick's signature. It's all public record. You can verify every piece of it. Kim studied the papers, her expression neutral and professional. I'll need to contact Reverend Merrick for comment. Give him a chance to respond. He'll deny everything, Lena said. Probably, but that's how journalism works. Kim looked up from her notes. I've covered stories like this before. Small-town power structures that go unchecked for decades. Usually ends one of two ways. Either the community wakes up and demands change, or they circle the wagons and protect their own. Which way does it usually go? Ethan asked. Ethan, depends on how tired people are of being stepped on. The photographer took pictures of the ranch, the repaired fence line, the barn with its new roof. Visual evidence of work completed despite obstacles, of a man fighting to keep what was his. Before Kim left, she paused at her car. This publishes Monday. Once it's out, you can't take it back. You ready for that? Ethan looked at Lena. She looked back at him. They'd come too far to turn back now. We're ready, Ethan said. The article hit Monday morning's front page above the fold. Power and property, how one man's stand against small-town authority sparked a community divide. Kim had done thorough work, interviewing not just Ethan and Lena, but also May, Jennifer, even a few people who supported Merrick. She'd verified the timeline, confirmed Merrick's board positions, and laid out the facts in prose that was clear and damning. By noon, it had been picked up by 3 regional outlets. By evening, a television news crew was setting up in Grafton's Edge, interviewing townspeople about the controversy. Lena and Ethan watched from the ranch as their private fight became public spectacle. The phone rang constantly, supporters calling to offer encouragement, reporters wanting follow-up interviews, even a few lawyers offering pro bono help with the bank situation. This is insane, Ethan said, watching his phone light up with another call. I just wanted to keep my ranch. You wanted to keep your ranch, Lena corrected. This is what it took. That evening, May called with news. Merrick held an emergency town meeting, tried to spin this as you attacking the community, making us all look bad to outsiders. How'd that go? Mixed. Some people ate it up, but a lot of folks are asking questions now, asking why he felt the need to go after you so hard, asking about the timeline in that article, asking if maybe he's been abusing his position in other ways nobody noticed. May's voice carried grim satisfaction. He's on the defensive for the first time in years. What about Walsh? Sheriff staying neutral, says it's a county matter, not his jurisdiction. But he's not backing Merrick either. That's something. It was something. Not enough, but something. The real shift came Wednesday, when the County Board of Supervisors announced an independent review of the inspection process, specifically regarding complaints filed by board members. Merrick's name wasn't mentioned, but everyone knew who they were talking about. Then the bank sent a letter, not to Ethan, but released publicly, stating they were suspending the loan acceleration pending the county review. Covering their asses, Lena knew, trying to distance themselves from potential scandal. We're winning, she said, reading the letter. We're surviving, Ethan corrected. Not the same thing. But Friday brought something unexpected. Reverend Merrick called, asking to meet at the ranch. Neutral ground, he said. Just a conversation. It's a trap, Lena said immediately. Maybe. But what's he going to do? We already went public. Anything he tries now just makes him look worse. Ethan picked up his phone. I'll tell him tomorrow afternoon. You're there too. You sure? You're part of this now. He talks to both of us, or he doesn't talk at all. Merrick arrived at 2 o'clock Saturday, driving alone in his personal vehicle instead of his usual pickup truck. He'd aged in the 2 weeks since the article published, new lines around his eyes, shoulders that didn't sit quite as straight. Ethan met him at the porch, Lena standing slightly behind. Reverend. Ethan, Miss Crow. Merrick's voice was different too, less commanding, more careful. Thank you for agreeing to meet. You said you wanted to talk, so talk. Merrick glanced around the ranch, the repaired buildings, the tidy yard, evidence of work done despite his best efforts to stop it. I came to apologize. The words hung in the air like something foreign, impossible. Apologize, Ethan repeated flatly, for overstepping, for using my position inappropriately, for... Merrick stopped, seeming to struggle with the words, for letting my judgment get clouded by pride. Your judgment, Lena said, her voice sharp, almost cost Ethan everything he has. I know, and I'm sorry. Merrick met her eyes directly for the first time. You were right, Miss Crow. What you said in the market square. We did abandon you. We decided who you were without knowing anything about you, and that was wrong. So why do it? Lena asked. Why come after us so hard? Merrick was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, he sounded older, tired. Because Ethan was right too. When Sarah was dying, this community failed him. I failed him. And instead of admitting that, instead of dealing with my own guilt about it, I convinced myself he was the problem. That if he'd just been more active in the church, more engaged with the community, things would have been different. He looked at Ethan. When you brought Lena here, when you chose her over the town's approval, it felt like another rejection. Like you were saying we weren't good enough, that you didn't need us. So I tried to prove you did need us, that you couldn't make it without the community's support. By destroying me, Ethan said. By forcing you to come back to the fold. I told myself it was for your own good, that I was helping you see sense. Merrick's laugh was bitter. Turns out I was just proving why you were right to keep your distance. Lena watched the Reverend carefully, looking for signs of manipulation, of strategy. But all she saw was a man facing the consequences of his actions, maybe for the first time. What do you want from us? Ethan asked. Nothing. I'm not here to ask for forgiveness or understanding. I'm here because the county review is going to find irregularities in how I handled the complaint against you. I'll likely be removed from the board, possibly face ethics violations. Before that happens, I wanted you to hear this directly. You were right, I was wrong, and I'm sorry. That doesn't undo the damage, Lena said. No, it doesn't, but maybe it stops me from doing more. Merrick turned to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, Miss Crow, you've been good for Ethan. Good for this place. Sarah would have liked you. He left before either of them could respond, his car disappearing down the long driveway in a cloud of dust. Ethan and Lena stood on the porch in silence for several minutes. That was unexpected, Lena finally said. Yeah, you believe him? Does it matter? The review's happening regardless. The bank backed off. We've got breathing room. Ethan turned to look at her. We won, Lena. Maybe not completely, maybe not perfectly, but we won. The county review took 6 weeks. During that time, life at the ranch fell into rhythms that felt almost normal. They worked together on projects that had been neglected for years. Repairing the cattle chute, clearing brush from the south pasture, fixing the irrigation system that fed water to the garden Sarah had planted, and Ethan had let die. Lena learned the land, learned the work, learned how to move through space without constantly waiting for the next disaster. Her hands developed calluses that stayed, muscles that didn't ache quite so much. The frightened woman who'd sat behind Murphy's store was becoming someone else, someone capable, someone strong. The review concluded with Merrick's quiet removal from the county board and a formal apology from the bank. The inspection citations were reevaluated by a different inspector who found Ethan's corrections adequate and closed the case. The agricultural exemption remained intact. Grafton's Edge itself changed more slowly. Some people remained hostile, convinced Ethan and Lena had embarrassed the town for attention. Others quietly shifted their positions, acknowledging that maybe Merrick had gone too far, that maybe the old power structures needed examination. May's Diner became a gathering place for the latter group, people who wanted change but didn't know how to make it happen. Jennifer started a community fund to help farmers facing financial difficulties, preventing future situations like Ethan's from becoming catastrophic. It wasn't transformation, just small adjustments in how people thought about power and accountability. 3 months after Merrick's visit, on a cool autumn evening with the first hints of winter in the air, Ethan called Lena out to the porch. He had papers in his hand and an expression she couldn't quite read. I've been thinking, he said, handing her the documents. Lena scanned them, her eyes widening as she realized what she was reading. Partnership papers, making her co-owner of the ranch, splitting everything 50-50. Ethan, I can't. Yes, you can. You've earned it. He leaned against the porch railing. This place needs more than one person to survive. Sarah knew that. Took me losing everything to figure it out, but I know it now too. This is your family's land, 3 generations. And it'll die with me unless someone else has stake in keeping it alive. You've worked as hard as I have. You fought for this place like it's yours. Might as well make it official. Lena looked at the papers, then at the land stretching away in every direction, then at Ethan. You're sure? I'm sure. She signed, her hand steady, making legal what had already become true in practice. The ranch belonged to both of them now. Not just Ethan's legacy, but theirs together. Winter came hard and fast that year. They worked through it, repairing equipment, planning for spring, learning to anticipate what the other needed before words were necessary. It wasn't romantic. They were partners in work, not romance. But it was solid, real, built on mutual respect and shared purpose. May stopped by one January afternoon bringing supplies and gossip from town. "Merrick's leaving," she announced, stamping snow off her boots. "Leaving where?" Lena asked. "Grafton's Edge, taking a position at some church 3 counties over. Smaller congregation, less power. Heard he requested it himself, said he needed a fresh start." "Good," Ethan said simply. "Also heard the bank's looking for a new board member. Jennifer's cousin suggested you, Ethan." May grinned. "Figured you might have some opinions about how agricultural loans should be handled." The idea of Ethan on the bank board, of having actual influence instead of just surviving at the mercy of others, made Lena smile. "You should do it." "I'll think about it." By spring, the ranch was thriving in ways it hadn't for years. They'd expanded the herd slightly, using profits from fall cattle sales and the money saved from community support. The garden came back to life, Lena learning from old notebooks Sarah had left behind about what grew well in this soil, what needed more water, what could survive drought. On a warm April morning, standing at the fence line they'd repaired together nearly a year ago, Lena realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd thought about Marcus. Couldn't remember the last time she'd felt that bone-deep fear that had defined her existence for so long. "You okay?" Ethan asked, noticing her stillness. "Yeah, just thinking about how different things are." "Different how?" "A year ago, I was dying in the dirt behind Murphy's store. Now I'm co-owner of a cattle ranch, standing on land that's mine, doing work that matters." She turned to look at him. "You saved my life, Ethan. You saved mine too, just in a different way." They stood there in comfortable silence, watching the cattle graze, watching the land green up with spring rain. The work was never done. There would always be fences to mend and animals to tend, bills to pay. But it was their work now, shared and sustainable. Grafton's Edge never fully embraced them. Some people remained convinced that Ethan had betrayed the community, that Lena was an outsider who didn't belong. But enough people shifted their thinking that the ranch wasn't isolated anymore. When they needed help, help came. When they offered help in return, it was accepted. Jennifer started bringing dates to May's diner, introducing Ethan and Lena to other farmers, building networks that made everyone stronger. Frank Morrison hired Lena part-time at the feed store during busy seasons, paying her fair wages and treating her with the respect she'd earned. Small victories, small changes. But they added up. 2 years after that first desperate day when Ethan had found Lena behind Murphy's store, they stood together at the county fair. The ranch had won second place for cattle quality, competing against operations 3 times their size. It wasn't first place, but it was recognition, validation that they were building something real. "Sarah would have liked this," Ethan said quietly, holding the ribbon. "Yeah," Lena agreed. "She would have." They drove home as the sun set, painting the sky in colors that made the land look almost beautiful. The cabin waited for them, solid and familiar. Tomorrow they'd start work on expanding the barn. They needed more space for equipment, for growth, for the future they were building together. But tonight they sat on the porch with cold beers, watching stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. 2 people who'd been broken in different ways and had somehow managed to put each other back together. Not perfectly. They still fought sometimes, still disagreed about how to handle problems. Ethan could be stubborn to the point of self-destruction. Lena sometimes woke up from nightmares about Marcus finding her, about losing everything again. But they were solid. They were partners. They were home. "You ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't stopped that day?" Lena asked. "Sometimes. Probably would have lost the ranch, probably would have given up completely. I would have died behind that store. No question." They let that truth sit between them for a moment, 2 lives that had been circling the drain, saved by one desperate decision to trust a stranger. "Glad you stopped," Lena said. "Glad you got in the truck." The night deepened around them, crickets singing their endless song, the distant sound of cattle settling in for sleep. Somewhere out there, Grafton's Edge was going about its evening, People having dinner, watching television, living their ordinary lives. But here, on this piece of land that had almost been lost, that had been saved by stubbornness and hard work and refusing to accept defeat, Ethan and Lena had built something that mattered. Not a fairy tale, not a perfect ending, just two broken people who'd found solid ground and decided to stand on it together. The ranch lights glowed warm against the darkness. Inside, the dishes from dinner still needed washing. Tomorrow's work already waited. Bills would come due, equipment would break, life would continue with all its complications and difficulties, but they'd face it together, and that made all the difference. Lena finished her beer, standing up and stretching muscles that were sore from honest work instead of starvation. I'm heading in. Early start tomorrow. Yeah, me too. Ethan stood as well, but paused at the door. Lena? Yeah? Thanks for not giving up. On me, on this place, on yourself. Same to you. They went inside, turning off the porch light, letting the darkness reclaim the land. But it was a different darkness than it had been, not empty or threatening, but full of possibility, full of tomorrow, full of life that would continue because they'd fought for it. The woman who'd been discarded, who'd become invisible, who'd sat alone in the dirt waiting to die. She was gone. In her place stood Lena Crow, co-owner of a working ranch, partner to a man who'd needed her as much as she'd needed him, survivor of battles that should have destroyed her. And the man who'd been drowning in grief and isolation, who'd almost let everything his family built crumble into dust, he'd found purpose again, found partnership, found reasons to keep fighting. Together, they'd taken broken pieces and built something whole. Not perfect, not easy, but real and solid, and theirs. The land stretched away in all directions, waiting for morning, waiting for work, waiting for two people who'd learned that survival wasn't enough. You had to build something worth surviving for. And they had.